I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video what we're going to do is to introduce Space Designer to begin to see some of its extraordinary features and to have a tour of some of the parameters that exist on its first page. Reverb comes in two different types. What we have first of all is the idea of algorithmic reverb, like Logic's Chromaverb. What it does is to basically artificially create a space into which you can place your sounds. And then at the other end of the axis we have what's called convolution reverb. Now what convolution reverb does is to use recordings of real spaces and to then take those spaces and allow you to apply them to any sound you like. So in other words, you could go into any hall in the world, capture an impulse response, and then effectively have its reverb, which you could then apply to the sounds within your track. Now what we're going to do is we're going to find a little bit of a loop here, and we're going to imply or superimpose an impulse response on top of that so we can hear how Logic's Space Designer reverb works. The two little bits of this beat loop that I've found that I want to apply reverb to are just here. I've chopped them already. This is what the whole loop sounds like. And by itself, this little section is this pitched little moment that happens here. And what we're going to do is to make that little bit a little bit more interesting by adding a reverb to it. So I'm going to just mute the rest of the loop, and here on this second track we're going to select Logic's Space Designer. Now that's going to be found within the reverb drop down here, and Space Designer is here at the bottom. And when we select this, we can immediately see what happens when we introduce this interface. What we're looking at here is this little waveform in the background. This waveform is a real space in which this reverb was captured and which we can then apply to our sound. And what we can do is to go and load a different one if we want to. Within the drop-down menu at the top, there are a whole range of spaces from which we can choose to add an impulse response. So we could come into halls, for instance, and come and find a nice long one like Dream Hall. I'm going to add that. Now automatically, when I can select a different algorithm or a different impulse response here, I can see the length of the recording. This is showing me the length of the reverb within that space, and we can see the waveform in the background here as well. Now you can see the overall length is here. This dial is controlling, or it's a match for the name of the file here. If I decide I actually want to use less of that file, I might make the reverb less or less lengthy. And what's going to happen then is that Logic is going to recalculate the new impulse response. So even though it's based on the same one, effectively because we're using a smaller one, it's just effectively resampled it. And you can see that that takes a moment. As I introduce the original length back up again, it will just take a moment before it shows us the new waveform again. So we have a chance to change its length, which is recalculating the reverb time. What we've also got is this kind of blue line which is being superimposed on top of the impulse response itself, and that is a volume envelope. It's basically changing the way that volume behaves over time, and we can control a number of things to do with that. So for example, what we could do would be to change the decay time. Even though I want to keep the impulse response the same length, what I could actually do would be to impose a different behavior from a reverb point of view on top of this sound by changing the original decay. So if we listen to that sound with the full impulse response on it first, it sounds like this. And what I'm going to do is change the decay time quite dramatically so we can actually hear how the volume envelope might affect the reverb response. So we can hear we've got this almost sort of gated effect now where the reverb is being cut short much more quickly and actually quite artificially. It's this really nice, interesting, but slightly warped effect. So we can open that back up if we want to. There are also things that we can do with regard to the sort of stereo spread of the way that the reverb behaves too. We've got this crossover point here, which is separating low frequency from high frequency. And what we can do is to either narrow or expand the stereo spread of frequencies from a reverb point of view within those two frequency bands. So if I want to, I could make the low end much narrower, much less spacious by reducing the overall amount of stereo spread at the same time as keeping the high frequency spread nice and wide. And of course over here on the left hand side I've also got my individual volume controls for the wet signal, the reverb signal and the dry signal, the original sound going into it. And by dropping this to 0 or minus infinity, muting it all together, we're just going to hear the reverb. Another nice thing that we can do is to change the quality of the way that this reverb behaves from a sonic point of view. We can deliberately lo-fi it if we want to. And up here in the top left-hand corner, we've got a little drop-down menu which allows us to go from high quality, where effectively we're hearing the highest caliber of audio imaginable. We can take that all the way down through two intermediate choices to lo-fi, where we'll end up with a much grainier response. So everything's just a little bit more crunchy, and that can work really nicely if you're looking for a slightly more lo-fi effect. So what we've seen is that there are a number of things that we can do here within Space Designer which allow us to work with impulse responses. Now, what Logic lets you do is to load your own impulse responses too. And there are a number of these available. You'll find actually lists of downloadable impulse responses from a number of different manufacturers. So it's worth having a look out for those on the internet. And what you'll find is that if you come into this drop-down menu and select Load Impulse Response, you can actually just go and find a file that's on your computer somewhere and load it as an impulse response. And one thing that can be really interesting to do is to use any audio file that's sitting on your desktop or on your computer hard drive somewhere and seeing what happens when that almost becomes like a reverb file for another sound. So within this video, we've begun to explore Space Designer. We've seen what happens when we browse through Logic's preset groups of impulse responses, which we can then apply as reverbs onto the sounds that we're working with. We've seen the volume envelope, which can be added to a sound in order to shape it over time. And we've seen some of the other parameters here as well within this plugin.